the Ascend at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
And I'm Caitlin Drake. I use female pronouns, she, her, hers.
Before we begin, I'd like to say that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We're recording this podcast remotely from our individual homes during the COVID-19 pandemic as we practice physical distancing as a church community. When the decision was made in March to close the church building in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we knew that our ministries would have to look different. Even though the building is closed, the church is still open, active, and engaged. What does a dispersed church or a church outside a building look like? This is the first in a three-part series talking with ministers and staff members of Boston Avenue UMC to discuss the ways they have been able to adapt, innovate, and change ministry during this time. Our guests today are our Executive Director, Angelyn Dale, Reverend Amy Venable, and Reverend David Wiggs. Welcome, everybody.
So we'll start with you, Angie. During this pandemic, everyone's jobs and responsibilities have shifted a little bit or a lot bit. So can you tell us a little bit about how your job and role has changed or shifted?
Absolutely. And this is Angelyn Dale, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. When we made the decision on Friday, March 13th, that we must close the building in order to keep our congregation safe, we were aware that that was only giving 48 hours notice to people that the place that they had attended, some of them for their entire lives, would not be open. Part of our concern was that there would be people who would show up not having heard that the building was going to be closed, and we needed someone to be able to gently make them aware of why we'd made this decision and that they would not be able to worship in person. I volunteered to be that person. As it turned out, we didn't have people who showed up. Everybody seemed to have gotten the word. But what we found was that there were a certain number of people who called in to register their attendance. In the past, we hadn't had someone physically in the information desk to take those calls. But over the course of time, the last 6 months, that's become, and I know it's just a tiny little piece of ministry, but that's become one of the parts of my job that I enjoy the most. For often, what I get every week is the same people calling in. Some of them call in to register their attendance because the whole technology thing is just kind of a bridge too far, and it's easier for them to make the phone call than to try to figure out what to click and where to do it in order to register online. Candidly, I think there are some of my people who call in because they really like the sound of another human voice and they want that interaction, as opposed to not being able to do the registration. But over the course of this 6 months, I've been touched to be able to speak to so many people. And we've gotten to the point now where I can see on the phone who it is that's calling, and instead of answering, "Good morning, Boston Avenue Church," I can say, "Good morning, Mrs. So-and-so, how was your week?" Or, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, you were going to a doctor's appointment on Tuesday and you were really worried about it. Did everything go okay? Are you feeling better?" And the ability to remember what's going on in their lives, to connect with them, to be a voice that actually cares about them in this time is so powerful for me. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. And it's not always about health-related things, although with that population, sometimes it is. I remember I've had one woman who's at the beginning of the pandemic whose children and grandchildren were quarantining with her. And then so she always gave me a huge list of people to register. And then the week came when it was just her. And it was clear that she was in pain from not having all of her family with her. And so we stayed on the phone for a little bit, kind of talking through how she would continue to have contact with them and how empty the house felt with all those little wiggly giggly people gone home to their house and not with her. We are so blessed to have an amazing congregation, and I'm just really honored to get to be a voice that they know they can hear every Sunday, and to be able to speak with them in ways that I hope in some way is meaningful for them. I know it's meaningful for me.
So in some ways, folks have been concerned that the pandemic is unraveling relationships, and between people and people and people and institutions. But in some ways, it sounds like for us, it has built new relationships, people that you would not have had that same degree of connectedness with prior to the pandemic. But these new responsibilities have really allowed you to build those.
Absolutely. Before the pandemic, my usual spot was to stake out the wall right outside the library, because I could see people coming and going in the bustle of the church as they moved to Sunday school after the first service or moved back the other way to go to the second service. And I often had great conversations with people from that vantage point. But to be able to talk to people who really need that human connection, and these are people, some of whom would be in worship every Sunday if that were possible for them. Others of them are not able to get out that way, would not be here, and would not have a human connection with us other than what they might be able to get during the week.
Let me jump in here. This is David Wiggs. I use he, him, his pronouns. Senior pastor here at Boston Avenue. Along what lines of what Angie's talking about, we also do follow-up emailing and texting and calling to people who register attendance for worship by being online. So she doesn't necessarily talk to those people on Sunday morning because they register their worship attendance in a different way. But as you were saying, Caitlin, people were worried about lack of contact. What we have found with those follow-up calls is we actually have a number of long-term television worshipers who had never registered their attendance. And because we've been encouraging that, and because they realize, I think, that there's nobody in the sanctuary with me really, that everybody is a online or television worshiper, we have found a lot of people who feel very connected to Boston Avenue that we had never talked to. A number of them then are also joining now that we have opportunity to have a conversation with them. They had not joined because they felt like they couldn't come to worship. Many of them live in, outside the metro area, but in the television viewing area, or they're online. One woman's watching online from Germany every week, that kind of thing. So, but we're finding these people. I'll just give you one example of a 90-year-old couple, lifelong Methodist. The little church they went to closed. They started watching Boston Avenue a few years ago. We'd never talked to them. We didn't know they were there. They were very loyal to their Methodist church. But now, since it no longer exists, they've joined us. Of course, then we find out they've got doctor's appointments and health issues and issues with their children. So we can follow up and do pastoral care for them in a way that was not, we just didn't have the knowledge to do it before the pandemic. So that's been a great way to connect with people, that the pandemic's encouraged people to, reach out and get in touch with us. We have a disabled veteran that had been watching that ended up joining the church once we began to talk with him. Again, lives in an outlying area, lives alone, but feels very connected to the church, and now is also joined in a small group via Zoom. So we have him connected with the congregation in a much more meaningful way than we did before the pandemic. So I could go on and on. There's just any number of stories where, because of the pandemic and because of worship going online for everybody, I'm speaking directly to the camera the whole time, that we've really been able to connect more effectively with people. Very surprising, but certainly is a positive.
Yes, and Angie, I was wondering, you have people calling you every Sunday, and sometimes do you think people are calling to register attendance a lot of times because they need that contact and they need the talking with a person from the church and feeling that just human connection?
I think that's absolutely true. I think some of them certainly have the technological capabilities to register online, but they like to hear a voice. They want somebody to ask how they are, and I am grateful. This has truly been a gift for me. I spend most of my time typically working on more administrative functions, so to be able to have this human connection and feel like something I'm doing is of benefit to the people that call in is a tremendous blessing, and I'm grateful for it.
We're going to continue on with making connections and with other people as we go through this time. To Amy, one aspect of your job is visiting people, whether it's their home or in the hospital. How have you been able to stay connected with people during this pandemic?
Well, hi, Reverend Amy Venable, she, her, hers. That's the question that came to my mind on March 13th when we decided we would not be meeting in person. And then I realized, oh, I bet I can't go to visit hospitals. I think by that time, the hospitals had already come out and said, nobody come in unless you're sick. And even now in September, we have a general rule in the big hospitals here in Tulsa that no one can come in unless you are the sick person. And then if you are the patient, you can designate one loved one who visits you consistently, but you can't rotate people. You must have that be the same person each time. Now don't take this for gospel. You need to check with the hospital if you have someone in the hospital right now. They may have changed those policies. But I thought, good grief, as Minister of Pastoral Care, what I do most of the time normally is get in my car and drive to St. Francis, St. John, St. Francis South, St. John Broken Arrow, Hillcrest South, OSU, and some of these specialty hospitals. So I feel like I have said on days when I'm kind of tired and low spirits, I'm the minister of driving, because I spend a lot of time in the car. Of course, that's good time for me to think and listen to tunes and listen to the radio and stuff like that. But I'm saving a ton of time by not having to commute anywhere. And Tulsa has gotten to be a big enough place that when you do have, we may have only 3 people in the hospital from our membership on a given day, but they might be 20 miles away from each other. So it'll take me most of the day to get to all of those places. And so I'm not doing that. And I at first felt very guilty about that. Oh my gosh, I'm not visiting folks in the hospital at the time of their greatest need. But it's not my fault. That's the rule of the hospitals. And that is the safest bet for you and your family and for me, frankly. So what I do is call people on the phone. If I can't speak to the patient, then I'll try to speak to the next of kin or the person in the church that I actually know who's related to the person. If that doesn't work, I look up and see if you have an email. I'll send you an email. You know, maybe you have your smartphone there in the hospital with you and you'll find my email. Maybe I'll send you a text if we have your cell phone number. But the thing I've taken on as a actually fun project to me, because I love to write notes to people, is writing notes to people. And I started out really before we had anybody in the hospital at all. There were no emergencies going on. And I thought, today I think I'll just open up the paper directory, the spiral bound membership directory. And I'm going to start with the first entry in A, and I'm going to write those people a note. And so I got to about, I don't know, AL or AK and thought, oh my goodness, I'm so tired. So I found that I didn't need to go alphabetically because things were coming up in your lives, and that I had reason to write you notes no matter where your last name fell in the alphabet. But now I'm up to about, I think, 723 pieces of mail I've sent out. So if the Postal Service fails don't look at me. It's not my fault. So my largest expense during this time has been on stamps, but I have a budget for that. And I have reached out to people whom I know well, who are in need, time of personal need, but I also feel like I've reached out to people who, according to records, maybe haven't been at the church in quite a while. We haven't had any contact with them. And in a couple of cases, I've received a note back to say, wow, this is wonderful to hear from someone. One lady wrote me back and said, I'm homebound now. I didn't realize she was. I live alone with 2 cats who are hilarious and keep me entertained. But I loved the contact that I got from your note, and please write me again. I also wrote a note to someone I remember as a little kid when I was a teenager at the church, and now we're the same age, which is really cool. We're both in our 30s, I think. No, she is, I'm not. And I wrote to her and said, hey, haven't seen you a long time. What in the world's going on in your life? Just thinking of you. Hope you're okay. She wrote back and said, well, I'm actually a respiratory therapist in a hospital now, and I'm working my tail off. And I have no contact with anybody outside the hospital. I know her mom. I know her sister. She says, I don't see mom. I don't see my sister. I don't see my nieces and nephews because I have to quarantine from everybody because I'm exposed to COVID all the time. And she said, I received your note and was overwhelmed, and I sat down and cried, and it was just tears of happiness that someone remembered me. So I don't feel like I'm saving the world with these notes, but maybe they're tiny points of light. And in a very pecuniary way, I guess, sort of an OCD administrative way, I'm figuring out, in some cases, do we have a current address on these people? Things like that.
And in a church our size, things like having a current address on people or just updates on their life can be really hard. I've found when we've been putting together the directory that you were utilizing, we're a large enough church that it's hard to try and keep track of everyone. I know growing up, I have 3 sisters, and my mom would confuse our names all the time. Like 3 people was a lot for her to keep track of. So imagine keeping track of how many folks are we at in our membership database. Does somebody have that number?
Nearly 8,000.
That was kind of the range that I was thinking. 8,000 people is a lot. So trying to keep those connections with everybody. In some ways, this has really grounded us and redirected our energies to be able to deepen those relationships. Perhaps not with all 8,000, but as many stamps as Amy can get.
That's right. Chris at the post office. Let's see, I know Chris at the Terrace Drive post office by name, and I come in and he says, hello, Amy. So this shows you how many stamps I've been buying on behalf of the church. We notice this in the pastoral care department. As soon as someone dies, it's a glaring red light to us if we know the contact information of the person who died, especially if they were significantly elderly, but often we don't have contact information for the middle-aged children who remain. And then we have to hunt around and look through small town obituaries in newspapers and so on. So it is really helpful if just while you're thinking of it, call up the church or email us and say, I want to make sure you have my current contact info and family member info. Not even if you, God forbid, die, but if you become sick, if you wind up in the hospital, and maybe we have to call your family for you because it was such a rush, you left without your cell phone, or you don't have your address book with you or something. So we can be a second line of human resource for you if you make sure we've got everybody's number updated. We'd appreciate it.
Amy, I was wondering something that I've been wondering for a few weeks now. I want to know, what is it like preaching to an empty sanctuary?
Okay, I think I might have a different opinion than my boss on this. I have found it, I guess I've done this twice since COVID-19 settled in. It's been my turn to preach twice over this time. For me, it has made it a lot less stressful because I think there's a part of my brain, the fear center of my brain that gets nervous, gets my game face on and makes my palms sweaty when I stand up to preach, where I can say, I am just talking to Angela behind the camera. I'm just having a conversation with Angela. Everything's going to be okay. But on a regular Sunday morning, I walk in and go, wow, there are hundreds of people here and they're all staring at me. And there are gazillions of people, not quite gazillions, but lots and lots of people watching on TV, not only in the Tulsa area, but over the corners of 4 states. And now that we're on the internet, anybody in the world who wants to log in and watch us on the internet. And when I worked at Boston Avenue before, there were a couple of times when Dr. Muzon Biggs Jr. was still the boss. And right before we walked into the sanctuary, he'd say, okay, Amy, just remember, people in a 4-state area will be watching you. And then the first hymn starts, da, 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 and I'm going down the aisle like, ah! He did know he could kid around with me, but the thought is always there, oh my gosh, but there's something about it that makes me feel like, okay, I'm just going to pretend I'm Neely Jones of Channel 8, who is my friend from childhood, by the way. She does this every night. She's in a tiny TV studio with a few camera persons and her co-anchor. We look at her and we think she's looking at the whole world, but she's just looking at one camera. I don't know. I feel like it has helped me and helped me be a little bit more focused in the way that I preach.
David, how is it like for you to preach in an empty sanctuary?
I am an extrovert, and so I actually miss the people and the distractions and the hustle and the bustle and those hundreds of faces Amy's talking about. That energized me. Having a great choir sing an anthem just before I stand up to read scripture and preach really is a ministry to my spirit and energizes me and inspires me, because I feel like that great music lifts the whole congregation, helps us focus on God when I go into that preaching moment. So I find I have to prepare in my own mind. I have to prepare differently in a sense of I've got to bring all that energy. I want the preaching moment to be stimulating and motivating and inspiring. And so I try to, in my own person, since there's not a lot of other persons in the room, kind of bring that same kind of energy that I get naturally from interaction with people and being able to see faces, so that I still hopefully still have the same kind of enthusiasm and energy and intensity in the preaching as I did when there was a room full of people and a massive choir singing just before I stand up. So it's definitely a different kind of experience to stand in a very large room with 3 or 4 other people, but try to bring the kind of focus and, inspiration that you would in a setting that is more typical to what I was trained for and practiced in. But the other side of it is, the feedback I'm getting from people worshiping with us via television is that lots of them feel like it's more personal now, because rather than me walking around and talking to people in the sanctuary, I stand there and look in the camera the whole time. So if you're sitting at home, it feels more like Amy was saying, you're having this one-on-one conversation. So lots of folks at home are saying, I really like this better. And so it's an interesting phenomenon, and we're going to have to figure out when there are people back in the room, how do we hang on to that real personal feeling for the worshipers who are not in the room, as well as addressing the people in the room. So it's kind of it's a learning experience, certainly, but it's been a shift in my mentality in terms of what I'm doing when I stand up.
I feel like this is Amy again, when I am up in the chancel with David, when he's preaching and I'm doing other parts of the service, I feel a little bit more compelled to be an McMahon type and, ha 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 ha, you are correct, sir. I feel like, oh my goodness, there's no congregation here. And he's saying really wonderful stuff. And charming. That was a charming story, and I just laughed out loud. And so, whereas I was kind of brought up to be quiet in church, I feel like, hey, yet I may clap my hands or say that's right or or something a little bit more than I usually would because you do. That's the flip side of what I said. You do need a little. It's nice to have a little feedback from the congregation. So that is weird not to have that in the room.
Amy, if you would stand up and applaud loudly at the end of the sermon, I could just tell everybody that I got a full house standing ovation.
Well, I'll just clap as hard as I can with two hands. And I don't want to make it sound like I wish everyone would stay home from now on. I bet I'd get a lot more confident if I had to do it every week, but I'm not wishing for that either. So please come back sometime.
Other than the empty sanctuary, I'm sure a lot of elements, well, I know a lot of elements of worship have also changed and made that component of your job very different, David. Do you want to talk a little bit about that or some of the other ways that your role as senior pastor has shifted?
Well, worship being a key function of the church and helping people enter the presence of God, vitally important. And it's we do it in a very different way now. And we've been talking about the sanctuary service, but they'll hear in one of the other broadcasts from Reverend Sarah and Reverend Jen in terms of the same kind of experience they're having in 13th Street, recording a worship experience without anybody in the room except for them and the people doing the recording. So, but we have gotten, with Joel's, who is our music director, for those who don't know our church well, finding from our archival footage music that we can drop in that does have a full choir singing and a congregation singing. We've been able to capture sort of the spirit and the feel of our traditional services. In the 13th Street realm, they do more contemporary music, so they've been having people record at home so that they still can provide music as part of the service, even though we're not singing in the room. We don't want to be super spreaders, even when there's only half a dozen of us in the room. So they're recording their music differently and pre-recording it, and we're using pre-recorded segments in worship. But it does allow us to continue the musical part of the worship experience in both those settings. So that's fabulous. The other thing that is a big change is, especially for someone, as I said, like myself, who's an extrovert, I like to be in meetings with people. I like to have dialogues and kid around and do work together. So since we're social distancing and we're not all in the same place, Zoom has become a very important tool for us. We're recording this over Zoom. We do our staff meetings by Zoom now. I do interaction with individual members via Zoom. I still do use the phone, but the Zoom, given the face and the voice together, is good. All of our Sunday school classes have shifted to Zoom meetings. So using technology in new ways has really been a part of that pivot. We had already been talking here about increasing our ability and our capacity to do ministry digitally. But the pandemic, put the pedal to the metal. We had to quickly adapt to that, realizing that when we're not going to be able to be together for safety reasons and health reasons, we do have technology that we can utilize to keep people connected. So I think that was one of the bigger shifts as well, is the shift toward technology as a tool for ministry. Also, just our daily devotions. We shifted immediately to let's do a daily written devotion, a daily video that we can put out on different platforms so that we help people stay connected and we nourish people spiritually, since we're not going to have in the building Bible studies or prayer groups or midweek meetings, those kind of things. So I think the pivot to technology and how we can utilize that for ministry has been a really important shift for us as well.
I would like to thank David also for what he's done in staff meetings. Pretty much every time we've had staff meeting, which has been largely over Zoom, which at first seemed like Star Trek, the Chris Pine version of movies. Like, what are we doing? All this stuff I have to learn, and now it's just as natural as brushing your teeth. Hopefully, that's natural for everyone listening. But anyway, David has taken to starting out the meetings with, how are all of you? Anybody struggling? Anybody having problems? I listened to, I guess it was a webinar the other day given by the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry of the United Methodist Church and led by Reverend Dr. Greg Berquist. He was talking about how to do pastoral care and end-of-life issues during COVID-19 and creative ideas for reaching families and being there without being there and so on. And I wrote down a really good quote, which I can't find, but anyway, he said, "It is important for us as caregivers to continue to take care of ourselves and to enter into the arena of our own feelings." That was the part I remembered. Enter into the arena of our own feelings as the healers, as the supporters, and take care of those feelings and be real about the anxiety you're having, the stress, the fear, the boredom, the ennui, whatever you want to call it, or even the sadness over your own losses, God forbid, that you're experiencing as a minister or lay worker in the church. And the more you get in touch with how you are doing, the better you will be as a caregiver. I've always heard that. I very openly tell people I go for counseling about once a month, whether I need it or not, because it probably ought to go more often. But that's a place where I can unload my head, wring out my brain, and do it safely and confidentially and get strategies for moving forward. So David and others in leadership have done such a good job of really taking time to say, how are you doing? Those of you who have little bitty kids at home, those of you whose parents have moved in with you, those of you who live far away and are really trying to do this distance-wise. So I appreciate the care that Boston Avenue has extended to the staff.
Thank you so much, Amy. I feel like that's a perfect sentiment to end this podcast on, to take care of yourself, do what you need so you can care for others. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us, Angie, David, and Amy. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Our producer is Alicia Urban. Our theme music was composed and performed by Wyatt Smith. Boston Avenue UMC is a progressive historic church located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.